The establishment of the Western spiritual identity, the sense of self, and the power that came with it, was shaped through centuries of conflict, transformation, and rediscovery. From the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine, Christianity rose from a small and often persecuted sect centered around Jesus of Nazareth into the dominant spiritual force that conquered Europe. As the Roman Empire slowly declined, the cross spread across the continent, carrying with it a new vision of the soul and salvation and mankind's relationship to the divine. But something else faded into the background. The philosophies and symbols and spiritual systems of the ancient world, the Egyptian mysteries, Greek philosophy, Hermetic thought, Kabbalah, and the hidden traditions of antiquity were increasingly pushed to the margins. Yet, they never fully disappeared. Over centuries, mystics, scholars, magicians, dissidents quietly preserved fragments of this lost and older current that was buried beneath Christendom. Then followed the cracks. The Reformation shadowed the monopoly that the medieval church had over the continent of Europe. Europe was now entering an age of conflict and identity crisis. And what emerged from that identity crisis was a renewed search, not merely just for exoteric religion, but for hidden truth, personal transformation, and the forgotten powers of the self. This is a story of spiritual rebirth from antiquity, the renewed discovery of the esoteric. Here we follow the story of a few spiritual dissenters to exoteric religion and sought to reach all the way back to the philosophies of old, not just as a resurrection of the past, but as a way of progressing the selfhood of Western humanity towards the dawn of a golden new day. Welcome to the Veiled Path Podcast. Hey Veiled Seekers, welcome to the Veiled Path Podcast. I'm Froilan, I am your host. If you've been following with us so far, we've gone through 2 episodes thus far of the discovery of the self, both from the Eastern and the Western sense. Now we progress through history, how the Western esoteric tradition evolved and came to us as it is today. As mentioned earlier, from the time of Constantine, the continent of Europe was baptized into the new religion of Christianity. Christianity had existed before the time of Constantine, but it had existed as a ragtag group, small sect that grew in small numbers only till it became influential enough to be outlawed in the empire, and then subsequently grew enough to influence the family of the emperor himself. Still, from the time of the end of antiquity to the medieval period, we see that the church grew in power and grew in influence, and the teachings of the church slowly usurped and replaced the teachings of antiquity. The so-called pagan world had been wiped out, and Christianity came in as her replacement. By the time of the medieval period, much of the ancient esoteric knowledge that had been passed down had been burned and wiped away. The church maintained this monopoly grasp on the soul of Europe until the medieval period saw the rise of a scrupulous dissident named Martin Luther, who one day nailed 95 complaints against the church onto the door of his nearby cathedral, thus starting what became the Protestant Revolution in Europe. As Protestantism spread across Europe, some seekers merely sought slight and moderate reforms to religion and the running of the church. Other seekers, on the other hand, were on a much deeper search for lost wisdom, lost truths that could revive the soul of Europe and take away the years of conflict that were going to come. What we see that existed in Europe were merely just documents that were spread around secret circles. These documents later became known as grimoires, as they maintained the historical magical secrets that had been passed down from the pagan world. In order to keep these grimoires as safe as possible, some had to be written and baptized into the Christian tradition in order to have them be mistaken as Christian documents as opposed to pagan ones. We also see some Jewish grimoires circulated around that time, particularly the Sworn Book of Honorius and the Lesser Keys of Solomon. These were Solomonic grimoires, where the tradition of the grimoires goes all the way back to the tales of Solomon, where he conjured spirits and demons in order to use them to build the temple to God. But as I said, some of these books and traditions had to be rebaptized into the Christian language in order to keep it safe and free from persecution. So, some ancient grimoires that had utilized theurgic practices to appease the gods merely switched the gods out with the names of angels. The conjuring of demons for material purposes would be used, as opposed to any other pagan spirits that had existed in the ancient time. While these works were not mainstream, nonetheless, they existed in the zeitgeist of the period they emerged from. Intellectuals and seekers studied them and circulated them amongst their elite friends. It is here, as we exit the medieval period towards the new age of the Renaissance, that we meet our first spiritual dissenter, whose contribution to the occult and the esoteric wisdom of the West was light years ahead of what was to come, mainly in Heinrich Agrippa. As I mentioned previously, some reformers against the Catholic Church wanted slight reforms around the edges and the peripheries of religion. They did not want to see the continent move away from its Christian heritage. Still, others went back further to the pagan world to find these truths that had been lost in the age of the church. Heinrich Agrippa lived at the same time period as Martin Luther. He was an intellectual, he was a philosopher, and he was a theologian that lived at a time when this esoteric knowledge was re-emerging, and you could get your hands on these works to actually study what had been lost. Works on Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah were now circulating among the elitist circles of Europe. These traditions had now entered into the Christian world and were now being discussed as possible means of implementation into the church's theology. Agrippa became a student of these traditions and studied each of them. And what he discovered was three main things. Mainly, number one, that the cosmos is alive. It is a living entity, a living organism. Two, that the inner cosmos of man is but a reflection of the outer cosmos that we see. And finally, three, that some esoteric knowledge can indeed elevate the soul of mankind to higher realms of knowledge and wisdom. All three of these explicitly went against the teaching of the church, and therefore this forced this knowledge to stay secret and in hidden circles. Regardless of this fact, Agrippa wrote his findings down and wanted to synthesize these teachings into concise works that could be studied following his time. He bounced these ideas off of his Christian faith, and while he was using the knowledge of antiquity, at the end of the day, Agrippa was a devoted Christian and sought to use this information to help his faith flourish. The most famous of Agrippa's works were the 3 books of occult philosophy. Prior to this work being written, much of the knowledge again was scattered and fragmentary. These 3 books were synthesized knowledge of the 3 main subjects he sought to teach about, mainly natural philosophy, celestial magic, and finally high ceremonial magic. Thanks to this work now, Agrippa stands as a pivotal figure from the lost knowledge of antiquity to the new esoteric wisdom that was being rebaptized in Christian language and given to the West. This tradition did not end with Agrippa, but would again pop up 100 years later in the person known as John Dee. So John Dee was a polymath genius in his time. He was an occultist who had studied these same lost traditions that were being studied by Agrippa. He had his own ideas of how to conjure spirits, and he became most famous and known for being appointed as the spiritual court advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Famously, he picked the date of her coronation using astrological charts as a means to pick the best day for spiritual enrichment to the Queen. John Dee had an extensive library for his time, and in this library contained these nuggets of lost wisdom, these grimoires from the medieval period, studies of Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, and Hermeticism. One thing that was important about Dee was his belief that truth can be conveyed through symbolic transference. Symbols were not merely just decoration, But symbols could be used to transmit secret truths, deeper wisdom, and could bypass language altogether. This became a factor in Dee's most important contribution to the occultic world following him, which was namely what was known as Enochian magic and the Enochian language. John Dee had a counterpart named Edward Kelly, who was a spiritual medium who Dee consulted to contact these spiritual figures through scrying. And it was these spiritual figures that helped Dee decipher what was to become a language that he believed was the lost language of Adam, what he deemed Enochian language. As Dee was indeed a spiritual advisor to the court of the queen, he had to earn his place in the royal court. He was generally viewed with disdain and distrust. So as Dee consulted these spirits, while he did seek spiritual edification and secret knowledge, he also sought to seek political knowledge from these beings. He would ask for information on the enemies of England. And sometimes this knowledge was indeed used for strategic tactical advantage over England's enemies in warfare. Regardless of that fact, Dee's purpose was indeed knowledge and wisdom. Sadly, the historical record does not end kindly with Dee and Kelly. Dee died in abject poverty towards the end of his life as he traveled across Europe, and Edward Kelly died in a prison. Still, both would go down as pioneers for occultic knowledge, and their contributions were heavily regarded as positive to those who came after them. We would not see this tradition die, but indeed we would see it continue to grow. Next, through the figure of Éliphas Lévi. The era that followed Dee and Kelly later became known as the Enlightenment period. And in this period, we saw a lot of religious and spiritual knowledge be discarded to the fringes of society. Instead, science took a higher place in the hearts and minds of Europe. Natural sciences and naturalistic philosophy flourished at this time, and religion was merely just considered fodder for the superstitious. Following this general 100-year period of the Enlightenment came a reaction. This reaction was known as the Romantic era. Romanticism saw the re-emergence of feeling and spiritual awakening as a reaction to the dry and long cold period that was the Enlightenment. What flourished through the Romantic period was writings on mystery, emotion, and spirituality. One man emerged from this era who was baptized in the spirit of his age. His name was Éliphas Lévi. Lévi was born in Paris, France, and was given the name Alphonse Louis Constant. Now, Constant was raised a Catholic and was indeed a devoted Catholic. He was so devoted that he joined the seminary in his youth, but in his time in seminary, he struggled with a sense of rigid religion and vows of chastity. As Constant began to experience this friction with the religion he was brought up in, he increasingly turned to the occult, the esoteric knowledge of his time, and studied it much deeper and deeper, and inevitably dropped out of the seminary. After years of studying and inquiry, in his 40s, Constant rechristened his name to Éliphas Lévi. He gave himself a Hebrew ceremonial magic name, and spent the next several years writing down the wisdom that he had acquired into some great works that we have with us today, primarily the Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. The book itself was published in 1850 and became a staple in the canon of occultic knowledge. Lévi united the wisdom of Western philosophy, Kabbalah, and ceremonial magic into a concise work that was greatly profound and had impacted those that were to follow. But all his works would be a main source to be consulted in groups that had formed following his time. The most important of these groups would later be known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a society dedicated to the study of occultic ritual and esoteric knowledge from the past. It was formed by 3 men from England named William Wynne Westcott, William Robert Woodman, and Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, no relation to Marshall. All 3 of these men were associated with Freemasonry or quasi-Masonic organizations. And that's important because each of these men saw the importance of initiatory progression through revelation and knowledge, and used this as the way to form their society. After the development of the Golden Dawn, the order saw membership grow even among the intellectual and elite circles of England. Some famous and notable members of the order were W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, Arthur Edward Waite, whose name is one of the contributors to the most famous tarot deck of the Western world, actress Florence Farr, the mystical theologian Dion Fortune, and most importantly, the beast himself, Mr. Aleister Crowley. Works that were incorporated into the teaching curriculum of the order were the writings of Agrippa, Dee's Enochian journals, and the works of Éliphas Lévi. As Agrippa and Levi sought to synthesize the various strands and fragments of occultic and esoteric knowledge of their time into concise works, the Golden Dawn sought to categorize and formulate curriculum of these works and allowed them to be progressively revealed through the initiatory phases. And what we see indeed from the private writings of the members of the order was not just an enlightenment of ancient wisdom, but the discovery of the untapped source of power that resided in each of these individuals. But herein lies the snag that was inevitably to destroy the order itself, mainly through ego inflation. What the order sought to do was to take magic from its low status of just material manipulation into the higher realms of spiritual ascendancy and self-realization. The unfortunate side effect of this work was indeed ego inflation. With ego inflation comes a competing sense of direction and competition. Sadly, this is what we saw towards the end of the Golden Dawn's era. As mentioned earlier, one of the most important members we saw in the membership of the order was Aleister Crowley. Crowley was a man of the world, a charismatic worldly libertine whose hunger for the occult never was satiated during the course of his life. Crowley ascended to the order's highest levels so quickly that it began to ruffle feathers and cause distrust amongst others in the order. Simultaneously, the heads of the order were beginning to fight amongst themselves, and competition over who had sole authority of the order began to take place. It was here that Crowley saw his opportunity to usurp power and authority. The avalanche began to fall as the Lodge of London no longer recognized the authority of Mathers as head of their order. After this, Crowley, who was loyal to Mathers, begged for the opportunity to be sent and authorized to take back the London Lodge for Mathers, or at least to take all of the items and implements that had been stored there. Crowley received his authorization from Mathers and immediately went to London. One day, Mr. Crowley shows up in full regalia on the steps of the London Lodge, demanding entry, also demanding to take back the implements that were stored at the lodge and rightfully under the ownership of Mr. Mathers. He was refused entry, and what took place was a physical altercation, mainly between W.B. Yeats and Crowley, who did not have much affinity for each other. Indeed, some of the rumors are that W.B. Yeats punched Crowley off the steps of the lodge. Following that day, personal accounts attest to magical warfare being cast on each other from both sides. Now, while this stuff is legitimate, spiritual warfare is indeed a real thing. I just can't help but think of the South Park episode, Mark Zuckerberg, what's your style? You can imagine these guys showing up like that cartoon. What's your style? Nonetheless, following these attacks, what we did see was the decline and fall of the Order of the Golden Dawn. We saw the dissolution of the order, the scattering of her members, and ultimately only one man emerged victorious and would continue his journey from there, namely Aleister Crowley himself. One major note of observance through each of these figures and the eras that they lived in studying and practicing the esoteric in the search for deeper understanding of the self of the Western seeker. The one thing that shines through each of these seekers and organizations that followed this time was not just the study of lost knowledge, but to the elevation of the self of the Western individual. In the West, what started as a church organization claiming to wield sole spiritual authority over the entire world merely resulted in clerical abuse and despair across the continent. By rediscovering these teachings that had been temporarily lost from classical antiquity, the spiritual search for the soul of mankind was rediscovered and reintroduced, now using the language and the mythos of Christianity. We see here religion is not the sole means of development of the soul, but merely the mythological framework to base these spiritual ideas and rituals around. As we saw earlier, what started as ritual practices to appease the god was then replaced with the names of angels and demons. The idea of the monad itself was replaced by the concept of God the Father. The role of the Greek hero from these lost mysteries of Greece, wherein the hero conquers the spiritual world, is now replaced by the Christ figure. One thing that the occult has taught these individuals and these organizations is that religion indeed, as we think to believe, is a subjective thing. But it can be used as a tool to overshadow these rituals and practices and to give these frameworks much more color and detail. Even more recent developments of occultic literature would seek to skip the color and detail altogether and merely just stick with the bare bones of the framework. But we see here through time that the color and the detail indeed shined forth and gave us a new way of interpreting this lost knowledge. Next time on the Veiled Path podcast, we're going to dive into the story of Aleister Crowley a little more, and we're going to discuss some aspects of the religion that he founded following his time in the Golden Dawn. And now some books I'd like to recommend for you guys. We covered a lot of books over the course of this episode, so I would like to recommend the books that were mentioned in the course of this episode. First, we have the 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa, which were written around the 1500s. Next, I would like to recommend The Ritual and Doctrine of High Magic by Éliphas Lévi, which was written in the 1800s. And finally, I would like to recommend The Golden Dawn by Israel Regardie. The initiation protocol and rituals of the Golden Dawn were inevitably written down following the dissolution of the order, and they were written by a counterpart of Aleister Crowley, Israel Regardie. And I recommend the newest edition, which is the 7th edition. It is a gigantic work, and it's been nicknamed the Black Brick. Thank you guys for watching this episode. I appreciate you guys so much for all that you do and your following. Please like this video, subscribe below, leave a comment. Any book recommendations you have, please feel free to let me know. I love to check out all the book recommendations, and we'll see you next time.